Hi, classmates. It's Liz. I decided to try to do a video post for our last discussion post. My technology wasn't working with me earlier today, so now I am late, but hopefully it will cooperate this time. In case any of you are interested, the technology I'm using to do this is Screen-o-matic, and I sometimes use this to do video audio feedback on my students' written drafts rather than like written feedback because like I don't know, it feels more personal and maybe personable for them to hear my voice and like hear my tone. But yeah, so I thought I'd like talk through some of the sources I've read and talk a little bit about um, their research approaches kind of in the context of like our class and of the gas chapter reading. So this is the first piece I've read. This is a dynamic usage space perspective on L2 writing. I should mention that my final project topic is L2 writing pedagogy in the context of complex dynamic systems theory. Um, and I was kind of at this point still kind of reading myself into my topic. So this one like doesn't relate as much, but interestingly, it's doing some things with research that my other pieces aren't. So these authors were responding in part to a call from Diane Larson Freeman, who's kind of the parent of complex dynamic systems theory. She called for like a common yardstick, like of a way to talk about levels for L2 writing proficiency. So basically they took 6 high schools in the Netherlands, and these are kind of like if you're familiar with like New York City public schools, these are like the selective high schools of the Netherlands. So these are like the Stuyvesants, the Bronx Sciences, the Brooklyn Techs, the sort of schools that are very, very, very hard to get into. And they looked at the writing of people at the beginning of their first year of English study, so ages 12 and 13, or their third year, ages 15 and 16. There were 22 classes included in the study. Some of these classes followed a program that was a little bit more immersive and intense. Some of them were more kind of like what we would think of as a standard language class. And basically, they collected one writing sample per student, about 200 words. They used the first 100 samples to have them scored by a team of 8 ESL researchers. They sorted them into 6 different proficiency levels, and then they leveled all of the remaining um, writing samples, and they had about 430 samples in total. And then they kind of looked for patterns or differences in terms of the development across those levels. So they ended up coding for 64 different variables, hand coding. They also use computerized language analysis. And they sorted students' kind of patterns into 5 domains. So they found that the total number of dependent clauses per text is a strong determiner for proficiency level. So is the proportion of present tense verbs, because this is going to decrease as students become more proficient. There will be some overuse at like level 3. Um, Chunks of language and how students are using chunks is a strong determiner at every level. Um, Word length is not helpful for lexical sophistication, and errors, sometimes certain kinds of errors occurred so infrequently that they couldn't really code for them. I have to admit that in terms of critiquing this piece, they they calculated all of the levels that they found to an equivalent in like the European standard frequency, and I think I just don't understand the Common European Framework, rather, um, ranging from A1.1 to B1.2. And I think I just didn't I don't know enough about the leveling to understand why they needed new levels. But they are trying to look at language development. They're trying to do a bottom up kind of sorting rather than a top down framework imposition. I also felt that like they chose students in the first and the third year of classes, but I think it would have been a more robust sample if they had chosen students in the second class as well. And now I'll move on to my next uh, source, but not talk about it in as much length. So from here on out, we move into studies that are more or less qualitative, not quantitative. This is actually a study that's come up in discussion as well in my other class that I was taking this semester, teaching writing to English language learners, which I recommend to everybody. It's a super fun class and I've learned a lot. So basically, this researcher, who is not a professor, worked with college students and had them work together, work collaboratively to write poetry in two different forms: simile poems and acrostic poems. And acrostic poems are they spell a word down the left-hand margin, and every line needs to start with the relevant letter, and it needs to be about like whatever the word is, like the word holiday or the word teacher, for instance. And this author, in addition to looking at what the students produced, used discourse analysis to really interesting effect to see how students were negotiating language basically with each other, how they were using language creatively. This author concludes that the students were, if we think about complex dynamic systems theory and this idea that like our language might fall into a state of equilibrium and we undergo a phase shift when we're learning something new, that the combination of a formal constraint and a semantic constraint in the acrostics was more helpful than just the formal constraint that existed in the simile poems. So this is a little bit more of a pedagogy in action kind of thing, although it's not action research because it was, I guess it's action research, but it's not by the classroom teacher themselves. So it qualifies as action research. It's qualitative, and it includes both discourse analysis as well as analysis of written artifacts. Because I'm focusing on writing, a lot of the studies I'm looking at use basically analysis of written materials, which I have a harder time sorting into any of the specific categories in the gas chapter, which seem to be a little bit more maybe about spoken language than written. This was not a very long piece, and it's one of the earlier pieces that attempt to use complex dynamic systems theory in classroom research, and it's kind of a fun read, so I recommend it if you're interested in those things. And we'll look at our next source. So this was the third source I read. It probably should have been the first source that I read, and it should have been maybe the first one I talked about. So here we've got Diane Larson Freeman, like I said, kind of the parent of complex dynamic systems theory and L2 acquisition. And this is like the earliest piece that appeared in applied linguistics about L2 writing and complex dynamic systems theory. So Larson Freeman, her title is helpful here. She talked to 5 L2 speakers of English who were all originally from China, so their first language is Chinese, and they were all in a program together in the U.S. And she basically she lays out kind of status quo theories and contrasts them with CDST theories here in a really helpful manner. the way that she puts forth her predictions is really helpful. Larson Freeman has said you cannot even really predict, you can only retrodict when it comes to complex dynamic systems theory because every learner is unique. And that's something that we're seeing here, something we would expect to see. That is, we are seeing like this focus um, on individual learners. And so learners were asked to repeat the same, like to tell a story based on the same prompt several times throughout the semester, um, in writing and then separately in speaking. What she found was that if you looked at all the writers together, like if you considered the writer's rounds of work from one date as like a cross-sectional study, right? Like this is a cross-section of writers, however small. You're going to see commonalities in development at all those points. But if you look at each writer longitudinally, you're going to see a lot of variation for every writer on different dates and kind of that individual level of development. So this is a tiny study, and it's not maybe what we would think of as a mixed methods study, but in a way, it kind of is a tiny mixed methods study because writers are being measured both in relation to other writers and in relation to themselves at different points over the course of this program. One of the things I've really come to appreciate about Larson Freeman is the clarity of her writing, like how she organizes herself. So she lays out her quantitative analyses and analytical uh, approaches under the label quantitative, as well as her qualitative analyses. I think something for me as a learner in SLA and applied linguistics right now, just because of my background being very like Englishy and writingy, I'm much more prepared to understand qualitative descriptors than quantitative descriptors. But that's why, like you can see these average growths in accuracy, fluency, vocabulary complexity, grammatical complexity. You see that complexity, accuracy, fluency, material from Skihan making its way over here. The individuals, I just want to give you a visual, the individual growth trajectories are much more, like there are some trends, but there's also like a lot of variability. These are the individual charts. So I love this kind of graphic expression of what growth might look like under complex dynamic systems theory. Screen-o-matic actually cuts off at 15 minutes, and I'm at 13 minutes, which is like way too long to ask someone to watch. So, especially with the tech problems and being late, I'm just going to submit this, but I do want to just highlight my other two, actually three more sources in case anyone watched this and is curious about other sources. So I want to highlight these researchers, Nida and Baba. They are big voices in complex dynamic systems theory with L2 writing, frequent co-authors. The particular piece I read by them has to do with task repetition, and it's really exciting. So if anyone is curious about it, please ask me about it. But this is the book that it's from. It's from the book Learning Language Through Task Repetition. My fifth source is a study of co-adaptation through journaling. This is Fogel and Koyama. I have more of a critique here, but it's still useful. This is changes degree versus changing kind. This author was a SALT lecture guest last semester, and I've written about his pieces one or two times in the reflection. And he did a longitudinal, like year-long, really in-depth study of one writer's growth. It's really remarkable to me, the depth of it. Either and Al Huri, a source he mentions here, I haven't checked out because they're book length, but they have released a book on like CDST research methods. Last but not least, if anyone wants to read up more on CDST and writing themselves, this is a review article by Gary Fogel. From Language Teaching, the journal 2022.